Hi, I'm Meredith Hutchison-Hartley.
I'm Frank Hutchison.
And I'm Emily Geddes.
And welcome back to the Hidden History of Business podcast.
Well, today I want to talk about how, women really don't have a place in the workforce. They really ought to be at home taking care of babies. That's the way it always has been.
Oh, man.
Oh,
you did that with a straight face. I'm really impressed.
Well,
today, if you haven't caught on yet, we're going to be talking about that frustrating myth that says that women entered the workforce around World War II.
And guess what? It's not true.
It is completely not true.
Wait a minute. I heard it on the internet.
Right, that. I mean, we've grown up hearing this over and over again, that women entered the workforce during the Depression or World War II or the 1950s.
But as we've discussed earlier on in this podcast, we have women like Martha Ballard, who was a midwife in the 17 and 1800s. Mm-hmm. We have Abigail Adams.
Yep, we've discussed in other podcasts that Abigail gets called the wife of the farmer, but John Adams was gone for most of the first 13 years of their marriage. She ran the farm. She ran the estate. And we've also done episodes on women who exploited legal loopholes to become shipping magnates in Pompeii. We've discussed the role of women in the beer industry in early Mesopotamia and other industries.
So basically, women have always been part of the workforce. This myth that women entered the workforce during World War II or the Depression is simply devastatingly incomplete.
And I like that phrase, that it's incomplete. It's not that it's untrue that a large volume of women entered a certain workforce, but it's not the whole picture. In fact, it's a very Western-centric, very U.S.-centric view, as if for the entire history, women weren't working, and then suddenly World War II happened to the United States, and women started working magically.
It also ignores or erases a huge portion of women based on class and race.
It ignores the contributions of women who came from lower economic classes, who were doing the agricultural work and a lot of the service-related work. It ignores the massive workforce that was female slaves.
Not to mention the lower-class women who went into the factories, starting with the Industrial Revolution, to do a lot of the manual labor, which was considered beneath men.
So we are going to try to expand our understanding of women in the workforce over the past several thousand years, really. We'll be looking at it from different classes, different races, different parts of the world to see what we can add to our knowledge about these different experiences of women throughout history.
And so we're going to do this introduction episode, and then we'll continue with this ongoing series. So I think one of the first important things to understand before we get into all of this is what work really means. Part of the problem with this women entering the workforce myth is that we're using a modern definition of work, which is based on the work of 1800s and 1900s economists, where work became anything that contributed to the gross domestic product that they could trace through a salary, through goods and services that were sold on the market. And so by those definitions, they could say women were entering the workforce based off of their very limited modern definition. But for most of history, that's not what work was. In fact, people didn't separate their lives into, I'm going to work, I'm at home. There was no work-life balance because work was simply, what do we all need to do to survive? And survival is not defined by gender or sex. It's about human beings finding food, shelter, and then creating stability in their lives.
So this episode is going to be kind of an overview of history. We're not going to go in depth into a lot of these topics, but we're going to kind of try to give you an overarching idea of what we're looking at during this series. We'll be doing several episodes for Women's History Month, but this is also going to be an ongoing series that we are developing. And we will go into more depth in later episodes in the series. This episode is just to kind of give you an overview.
So as long as we've had history, women have been doing work. We've talked about the different examples that we've talked about already on our podcast. The basic purpose of work was, first of all, to survive. Back when we were all hunter-gatherers, everyone had to gather the food because you couldn't store food. So whatever food you found, you consumed. It might last for a few days or even a week or so, but there's no long-term storage. Then, when we moved into agriculture, the situation changed. You start having people being able to store food. In fact, I recently heard where back when we started farming, one person could harvest enough grain in the form of grasses that had seeds in 3 weeks to feed a family for a year. So all of a sudden, You started having some food security. You didn't have to worry about, hey, what am I going to catch tomorrow? Or what am I going to find tomorrow so I can eat tomorrow? Now you had food that you could depend on. This allowed people to not only to survive, but also now they had time to start specializing. As you have the specialization, you start having some differences between the sexes, but there's still not a whole lot. If you were a woman, you were concerned with the home, but you knew how animals were hunted. You knew how to find food, because that's something that everybody knew. If you were a man, yes, you were out there doing the hunting. You're probably gathering food as well, but you also knew how to cook the food, how to prepare skins for preservation, for covering, how to build. These were things that everyone saw. Everyone was able to understand how they were done. You had a common community-based knowledge. Then the more you do something, the better you get at it. So that means that if you're a woman and you're doing a lot of the cooking, after a while, you get very good at it. You need about 10,000 hours to become a specialist or an expert in something.
And this eventually led to the more formalized divisions of labor in different societies.
It didn't mean that the men didn't know how to cook and that the women didn't know how to hunt.
So going back just past moving into agricultural societies, moving out of that hunter-gatherer society, if you go back to our episodes on beer or intro to beer and beer in ancient Mesopotamia, you can go back and listen to those and hear about how women dominated the brewing industry in ancient Mesopotamia. That was considered their arena, and that was a strongly female-dominated industry, to the point that we read about it in the Code of Hammurabi. It was formalized. Women were working in food production, in hospitality. So we know from these resources that women were business owners. They were producing product. Pretty much if there was an industry that men were working in, women were working in it too in ancient Mesopotamia.
Looking at ancient Egypt, it's very similar. Women worked in weaving. They worked as professional mourners. They worked as entertainers in the music business. Unskilled women were often domestic helpers. Some of the job titles that have been found in ancient Egyptian archaeology for women are hairdresser, grinding girl, supervisor of the cloth, supervisor of the wig workshop, treasurer, steward, composer, songstress, prostitute, weaver, dancer, musician, mourner, priest, supervisor of the dancers of the king, and supervisor of the royal harem. That's quite a wide variety of careers for an ancient Egyptian woman there. And then maybe perhaps a little more familiar to some of our listeners, the Bible talks about working women throughout its history. We have Deborah, who was a judge in ancient Israel, as well as a military leader. The very famous passage in Proverbs 31 talks about this supposedly ideal woman of valor, I believe is the specific translation, but they talk about how she seeks wool and flax and worketh willingly with her hands. She considereth a field and buyeth it. With the fruit of her hands she planteth a vineyard. So we've got some, real estate, some agricultural development going on there. She perceiveth that her merchandise is good. She layeth her hands to the spindle, and her hands hold the distaff. So we've got some merchandise. We've got some weaving, some cloth, textile work going on. She maketh herself coverings of tapestry. She maketh fine linen and selleth it, and delivereth girdles unto the merchants. So we've got some, merchant work going on here, some selling and trading. Rahab in the Old Testament was called a harlot. That was her job. That was her profession. And I'm sure you've heard it said that is the oldest profession, though we will quibble with that a little bit. And
obviously that was a profession before there was food production or childcare or agriculture. That's such a silly myth.
Well, and then you also have the idea of wet nursing with Moses, for example, when his mother put him in the basket and sent him down the river, and the Pharaoh's daughter discovered him. Moses' older sister had been following along to watch and make sure that he got somewhere safely, and then she told the Pharaoh's daughter that she knew an Israelite woman who could act as Moses' wet nurse, and of course it was his mother. But wet nursing has been going on as a profession for thousands and thousands of years, and we'll talk about that in a later episode. Ruth and Naomi in the Old Testament, they were gleaning as a survival technique, gathering the grain from the field after it had been harvested. Mm-hmm. In the New Testament, Lydia comes up a lot when we're talking about women in the workforce. She's called a seller of purple. which has been interpreted by many scholars to mean that she was a merchant for a very rare dye or cloth that had been dyed purple with this very rare dye. So once again, we have a woman in commerce who is supporting herself. We have women in the New Testament that act as patrons.
So even in what are traditionally viewed as very male-dominated texts and societies, women were there. They were doing all this work. And that leads us into the history of Asia, particularly the Silk Road. Most of our stories about the Silk Road are about Marco Polo and about the male merchants and kings and leaders who were traveling that back and forth. But let's not forget that the people who were actually making the silk were women. The primary silk workers were women, and there were many women who were economic powers all across the Silk Road as well. They served as merchants, and frequently while their husbands were away traveling, they were the ones running the family's estates, their businesses, acting as the merchants, the negotiators, building alliances. They were doing that at home, and women were frequently slaves, indentured servants, and workers in these caravans moving across the Silk Road as well. They just aren't as recognized in the great myths that we tell.
Because very often, they're not the ones who wrote the history.
Exactly.
I mean, Marco Polo, in his book, he was the star. Mm-hmm. He wasn't worried about all those other people. It was him.
Mm-hmm. Yep, a lot of the documents we have about merchants during that time period were really just another form of propaganda. They were self-promotion. So of course they're not going to mention the other workers who were getting things done. They're focused on promoting their stories. So it's not... While it is a historical document, it is not necessarily a complete history. Also, if you've listened to our episode, Women in Pompeii, you know that even though in both Greece and Rome there were very restrictive laws on women in business, and in theory women shouldn't have been able to participate in business, many women found ways around that and exploited loopholes in the law to become shipping magnates and merchants and own vast amounts of property as landlords, as well as the fact that women, again, were slaves all throughout these societies, particularly in Greece and Rome, and they were doing a huge portion of both the manual labor, the household labor, and more sophisticated skilled labor as tradesmen and craftsmen.
So moving on in time a little bit, and remember, we're just kind of doing an overview. We're going to be skipping over some chunks of time.
We have more goodies in store for you.
We do. But looking at medieval times, I love reading historical fiction, and I was fascinated several years ago when I discovered a series by Peter Tremaine. It's actually a pseudonym. His main character is Sister Fidelma. She is a Celtic nun in about the 700s, but she is also an Irish daily or lawyer. You think of this time as a very patriarchal society, very male-dominated in large part because that's who wrote the history.
And it was. There's no
absolutely.
contesting. It was an extremely male-dominated time period.
But you also have these fascinating stories of women like Sister Fidelma, who were an Irish, well, it's kind of a cross between a lawyer and a judge, this daily, and nun. And speaking of nuns, we'll be going into more depth on this in a later podcast, but convents were an enormous source of economic power during this time period. Women would give their dowries to the convents. This was a way for them to assert their independence from men in some cases. In other cases, it was a way for families to control the fortunes by sending a daughter to the convent. It prevented diluting their family fortune later on because they could keep it with one child instead of having to split it between 2 or 3 or more. But during medieval times, you also had women who were working as merchants. You had women who were working as apothecaries.
And the convents themselves were businesses.
Oh, absolutely.
Yep.
Convents, I mean, we've talked about how monasteries often made money from beer, from housing,
food.
As landlords, from rents, and...
Absolutely. The same thing goes with convents.
And these were businesses that were run by women of many different social classes. They really became kind of a leveler in that case. Well, and during the same time period, you have this vast stretch of different social classes. You have, within the feudal system, you have women doing agricultural work all agricultural work. They were working in the fields. They were creating saleable products from the byproducts of agriculture. They were providing services to others as healers in healthcare, as midwives. They were in hospitality industries. They were serving in larger houses.
And they were making the beer.
They were still making the beer. As we move up, of course, we see women as merchants. We also, in the higher aristocracy and in royalty, consider women like Catherine de' Medici and Eleanor of Aquitaine, who supervised large families, who ran their own countries, their own property, but also had to mastermind their own family's survival. They were brand managers. They were working in strategic development. They were negotiators. They were fighting hostile takeovers. These were women who were functioning with business skills that we still use today.
And then you get to Shakespeare.
Well, yeah, the literature of the time is full of women in business.
Oh, yes.
And we see women in Henry IV and in the other plays functioning again in business roles.
Well, and the Canterbury Tales.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Well. Yeah, you have women like the Prioress and the Wife of Bath and nuns and other women who are participating in this kind of travel narrative that focuses a lot on the economics and the dynamics of the time.
And we'll go into more examples in later podcasts. Let's go forward a few hundred years to the colonial period. Women operating as seamstresses. They ran boarding houses. The production of saltpeter.
Which was critical for the American Revolution. That was saltpeter.
It was a critical component of gunpowder. Gunpowder consists basically of charcoal, saltpeter, and sulfur.
So these women were chemists. They were creating chemical compounds.
They were. You had women who were the midwives. They were doing the agriculture while the man was off fighting the war. They were the state managers. Martha Washington, for example, had to run Mount Vernon while George was off fighting the war.
And I will link to these on our site. We have some pretty intense documents. They're actually the records of women who were widows or who inherited land and how they managed their estates. Very, very complex businesses, because that's what life was then. You didn't separate your property, living, your business from anything else. That was your life, and you survived and you managed it.
And it was a very critical component because a lot of the estates were actually in debt to merchants in England because they depended upon a primary cash crop of tobacco. One of George Washington's great breakthroughs was the fact that he diversified and got away from tobacco, so he didn't have debt in England.
So women were managing all of these problems as well. But what's also constantly overlooked in all of these time periods is the work of slaves. I know we've said this several times now, but when you look at the colonial period and the 1800s in the United States, slaves were the primary agricultural workforce for more than half of the United States at the time. They were the home-based service industry, working in homes, and also as skilled tradesmen, as apprentices, and as workers. If you've been following the Hamilton zeitgeist, during one of the cabinet battles in this very, very popular musical, it just won a Grammy, you have this conflict between Thomas Jefferson and Alexander Hamilton, because Hamilton wanted to create a national bank, absorbing all of the individual states' debts so that it would go through one federal system. And Jefferson objected to that, saying, in the South, we don't have a lot of debt. We plant seeds. We create things here. But in that particular piece of the musical, Hamilton's response is, no, we know who's really planting the seeds. This is a simplification, but the truth is that Southern states didn't have a lot of debt because they had a huge unpaid workforce. So, of course, they could have less debt than the northern states. Of course, they could have stronger economies because they didn't have to pay the labor for their time. They had to feed them, they had to house them, but they could get away with doing a pretty crappy job of that too. This conflict is part of what led to the Civil War later, was that especially those female slaves, were so valuable as members of the workforce that the South didn't want to lose them because their economy depended on them. So please remember that female slaves have always been a very uncredited part of the American workforce who significantly contributed, basically built our gross domestic product through the colonial and 1800s periods.
So now we're moving into the Civil War. And I think one of the areas that is most well known for women in the Civil War is nursing. We start to get into this idea of modern nursing. Florence Nightingale actually came to prominence during the Crimean War more than the Civil War, but many of the things that she learned and taught were used during the Civil War. I don't know if any of you are watching the PBS miniseries Mercy Street. It's a little gruesome,
But fascinating.
It is fascinating. But they're talking about, it's set in a hotel in Alexandria, Virginia, that has been turned into a hospital for wounded soldiers. And so you're seeing very much what was modern medicine in 1860-something. And it's a little gruesome at times.
But it's also full of women who are doing the washing, they're doing the nursing, they're doing the food prep.
Absolutely. So we get to see all of these women in these different roles. Moving on from the Civil War into the Industrial Revolution, we start to see a big shift from agriculture to factories. We're seeing this massive movement of the population from a rural agricultural-based system to factories, to urban centers, to businesses in higher population areas. And that's going to bring more women with it as well.
In fact, women were a huge bulk of the manufacturing industry workforce. Mm-hmm. It was a leveler. Anyone could walk in and work in these factories as long as they were trained. And so you had a huge number of women from lower economic classes moving to the city because it gave them a chance to earn a regular wage. So part of the Industrial Revolution of the 1800s was women becoming part of this industrialized manufacturing workforce, including children. And those children who were part of the workforce, half of them were female. Those are women in the workforce as well. And that's often erased when we discuss women in the workforce.
Well, and a lot of the work that they were doing now in factories was work that they had been doing in the home, like weaving. That had been something that was done in the home. Now it was moved into the factories because it was now industrialized.
Well, yeah, one of the most iconic images that's discussed frequently is women and children working in thread factories, where they wanted them because they were lighter and you frequently had to climb the machines to go up and change spools, which was very dangerous. Their hair could get caught, ripped out, a lot of industrial accidents occurred. But women and children were specifically sought out for those jobs.
Now, overlapping the Industrial Revolution is the Victorian era. Mm-hmm. So we have a kind of a different angle on it as well. Not only did we have this move from the agricultural-based society to factors and urban centers, but we also have this Victorian ideal coming in.
This emphasis on women as the angel of the home, as being primarily supposed to be in the home and focusing on those domestic tasks, which were supposed to be their area and weren't really valued significantly, even though this is work that had previously been done by paid employees, by house servants, by slaves. Suddenly, this was the job that the women at home were supposed to do without any compensation. They're supposed to be very happy about it. And it's cleaning, it's childcare, it's managing the home, it's food preparation. That ideal is kind of divorced from the reality because, as Emily said, while the media of the time was painting this ideal of the gentlewoman at home, it was side by side with these people working in factories and hard agricultural labor. And as you move to the later Victorian period, freed slaves were still doing the exact same work they had done before for very, very low pay. They were still doing agricultural work and home service work as well.
What you're really seeing here is a class division because the ideal was being applied to the upper class women. They are the ones who didn't have to work. They were the ones who could also afford servants.
Right.
So the ideal home was an upper class concept.
And it's just important to recognize that that Victorian period was not separate from the Industrial Revolution. These were happening side by side.
Well, now, and talking about something that's happening at the same time, you have the American frontier.
Mm-hmm. Western expansion.
And really, this covers, a period of about 300 years because it goes from the 1600s on the East Coast all the way through the 1900s, where you have people who are moving out from the settled areas into areas where they have to literally create whole communities and homes out of nothing, out of just the raw resources that they have. And there's many stories of this. It's been romanticized in Hollywood movies.
But the reality is
that it was a hard, brutal life. It was not uncommon for a lot of people to die along the way getting there, and it was not uncommon for men to die. In fact, one of your ancestors, he and one of his sons were driving a wagon and it overtipped and they were killed. And so your great-grandmother had to take care of her family and her homestead and everybody else
But she could do that because she'd always been doing it. She knew all the tasks. And that's the thing that defined the frontier, is that women were working again side by side with men. We have that romanticized view of division of labor. If you were working a homestead, you had such limited labor. Everyone was doing all of the work as needed. In fact, our great-grandmother, Lillian Eschler, in the early 1900s, homesteaded her own property in southern Idaho. And that involved her having to claim the land herself, work the land herself, establish it, live on it. And she was coming from a relatively poor family. There were a lot of children. It was a polygamous family, so there were 2 wives and a lot of kids. And she didn't have money on hand to pay for workers. So she was doing this work herself. She successfully homesteaded her own land.
And this was before she was married.
Yes, it was her as a single woman doing it. She also worked as a school teacher, and she worked as an agricultural laborer. This is the work women were doing on the frontier.
So moving into the 1900s, there's again a bit of a shift. We're seeing increased industrialization, so more women are still working in factories. There was the great tragedy of the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire in 1911, where 146 people, including 123 women, mostly Jewish and Italian immigrants, so among the poorest and lowest class, died in this fire in this factory, trying to provide for themselves, trying to have some sort of income in an urban setting. But we also hit the First World War in 1914 through 1918. We hit the Depression, 1929 to 1939. We hit World War II, 1939 to 1945. And at the same time, remember, we still have these ethnic minorities. There's huge Asian, Irish, Black populations that are mostly in service industries. And also, as I said, Jewish and Italian immigrants were also considered ethnic minorities working in the factories in horrible working conditions.
Mm-hmm. And that gets overlooked frequently because of our misconceptions about those time periods.
Yeah, right, because we're still the early 1900s before women, quote, entered the workforce.
But you also have the perception still from the Victoria era that women should be in the home. The married woman especially should be in the home. Your great-grandmother lost her jobs in the Depression because the thought was the man has to have the job, and if the woman is employed in a position that a man could fill, she was taking the food away from the family, so she's fired and the men are hired.
But at the same time, just because women were being fired from jobs in order to employ men, those women still had to go out and find work to support their families. And I really encourage you to go hit up the History Chicks podcast. They have an episode on Lillian Gilbreth, who was an amazing scientist. She was an expert in efficiency and worked side by side with her husband. And then after her husband died, she became a force in recognizing the work that women were doing in the 1920s, the 1930s, leading into World War II.
If you've ever read Cheaper by the Dozen, that's her.
Yep, that's her and her family.
But even that's a great example. If you watch the movie Cheaper by the Dozen, it's romanticized of what her contribution was.
Oh, yes.
Yep, it's barely recognized. So really, please go check out that episode. We can't do it any better than they did. And then you reach the 1940s, this period where supposedly women entered the workforce.
And you get propaganda.
Oh, so much propaganda. But the reality there is that, yes, women were entering a workforce.
Yes. Women were really entering industries that they were not traditionally in.
Particularly the military industrial manufacturing.
Yes. Moving into shipbuilding, Rosie the Riveter is a classic one. There's also Wendy the Welder, depending upon whether the ship was riveted or welded. You have women moving into munition factories. And in fact, that would happen both in the United States and Great Britain. Women moving into those industries which traditionally had never seen women in, operating heavy machinery for the most part.
And I'd never seen such a giant influx of workers at such a rapid rate. Women were entering the military industrial manufacturing industry, which, women had been in manufacturing for a long time, as we discussed. They were working in spool factories. They were working in clothing manufacturing. But there is a huge difference between the degree of accuracy and quality control in a clothing manufacturing environment versus a munitions factory. The cost of a failure is much worse if there is a mistake or a defect in a bullet casing than if there is a defect in a spool of thread. And that was what the real issue was here, is that a huge volume of women were entering these military industries and had to be trained in a new system of quality control.
And that was a real problem in World War II because a lot of American artillery shells at the beginning of the war were not functioning properly.
Mm-hmm. And so that was what the real emphasis was there, was that women were entering a new field where they needed to learn a new system. They'd been working in manufacturing for ages. And through propaganda, they were also trying to attract women from a group that previously had not worked in those fields, women from middle and upper class families.
Who were most likely much better educated than lower class, unskilled workers. And so you see this propaganda aimed not only at encouraging women, particularly middle class and upper class women who are educated, to enter this workforce. You also see this propaganda aimed at the men, encouraging them to see women as fellow workers. There are some great propaganda posters that we'll have linked on our website. One of my favorite has this man, and he says, "Turns out you gals are useful after all."
And I have one that is always hanging in my office where a man and a woman are sitting next to each other, and he's saying, "Good job, sister. We never figured you could do a man-sized job."
Doesn't that just...
That's just
warm your heart.
Heartwarming, considering what women had been doing for millennia before that.
So we'll link to some of those on the website.
In 1944, in fact, an official U.S. propaganda film called Women in World War II was made by the Signal Corps of the United States Army. It talks about why women are in the services and how the good that they do. But the best part of it, for me, is the very opening.
Oh, gosh.
Starts with two guys on the porch sitting there, and they see a whack walk by.
No, a petticoat soldier.
Yes, they call her a petticoat
soldier. Well,
soldier.
They call her a petticoat soldier. So, why would their sister want to be a whack? And then it goes on to explain all the jobs that they can do.
Oh, first they say that for her being there, it would be a waste of time because this is a man's war.
Well, yes.
Right, that. Mm-hmm. Mind you, this is 1944. It's 3 years into the war effort.
Yes. And, the U.S. Army has gone from 190,000 people to nearly 9 million people.
Which is just insane. That's crazy.
Huge. It's that influx of people moving into industries they hadn't been in.
Well, that's why they needed them for the Army and the Navy, and so someone had to take their place in the factories.
And they talk about some of the jobs these women were doing. I mean, specifically, they list X-ray techs, inspectors, instructors, technicians, mechanics.
Tank drivers. Mm-hmm. They were doing tank drivers. They were firing artillery.
My husband's grandmother was an airplane mechanic. He actually took care of Charles Lindbergh's plane on several occasions.
Yes. So, they were doing a lot of the jobs that the men had been doing and were still doing, but now it was kind of a shift. And what you actually see in World War II is that the women followed the men. For example, the Waves in the Navy, they started first serving just in the continental United States, then they went to Hawaii, and then they went to the forward support bases, and eventually they even ended up in Tokyo.
Every duty station you can imagine, women were there as well. What I find really interesting about the video, though, is that it's talking about women working, but it's not completely geared towards those women, like we discussed. No. It's trying to convince men to accept women in the military, and we hear that and how they're talking that whacks do the work of two men. They're trying to get these traditionally male-dominated industries to respect women, because if a woman is your factory foreman, if she is your mechanic, they didn't have time for soldiers to sit there arguing with someone just because they were a woman. They needed them to respect that because it was dangerous not to.
And they had General Marshall come on at the end talking about how women and men will be walking shoulder to shoulder at the end of this war when the war is won. We're all one army. We're all, one group of people working together to win this war.
And the other really fascinating part of this video is the area that is specifically geared at women. They talk about how there are these myths that you can't wear makeup and you can't have different hairstyles and you don't get to wear stockings in the military and you can wear whatever cosmetics you want and your hair can be any style as long as it's nice and neat. And they even have this absolutely off the collar, this gratuitous shot of a woman slowly putting on stockings with a super close-up of her leg, her ankle. That was adorable. But that's also because they weren't targeting the women who were already in the workforce, women who had been laborers, who had been factory workers, women who were coming out of those southern agricultural societies, black women, immigrant women. They were targeting these concerns of upper class women. They were the ones who would be concerned about their makeup and their hairstyle and the gentility of living. And they even discussed recreation, playing softball and volleyball and these other recreational sports.
Oh, and they had dances.
Oh, they had dances. And you see them in very neat, sharp outfits, because this is targeted at attracting women from those upper classes and from that upper middle class who had not been working. They were trying to attract them into the workforce. So that myth of women entering the workforce really was generated by the fact that these idealized upper class women were being lured into the workforce.
And that kind of brings us to the idea of the separate spheres and the cult of domesticity we're going to kind of wrap up with here. Mm-hmm. Now, the idea of separate spheres is not a new idea. They were writing about it back in ancient Greece, that men had this job and women had this job. And we've talked about it a little bit before, but this idea that the spheres should stay separate and women have this area to be experts in and to take care of the home and the children, and the men are the ones that are to go out and to be involved in the dirty business of politics and business and whatnot.
And also inherent in the separate spheres isn't just that, oh, this is how we're going to divide it up. It's that there is something inherent about women that makes them unqualified for the things in the male sphere. And there's something about men that inherently makes them unqualified for work in this traditionally female sphere.
And we also see this line of thought show up again in the Victorian era.
With a vengeance.
Oh my goodness. The cult of domesticity. And it really is a cult.
It is.
And again, it was a very classist idea. It really only applied to upper and middle class women during this time period, because they were really the only ones who could afford it. Mm-hmm. But it's the idea that the wife, the mother, is the queen of the home, and that was her sphere, and her job was the household general.
Mm-hmm. Well, she was to be the angel of the home and the household general.
Right. So it's these two very idealized, pedestalizing roles that women were expected to fill and fit into.
She was to keep her house in perfect shape, emphasize cleanliness, raise her children, and focus on this perfect little nuclear family.
True women were to hold and practice 4 cardinal virtues: piety, purity, submission, and domesticity. Doesn't that sound fun?
And the role was to create this refuge, this perfect sanctuary for her husband and children. Now, we want to reemphasize that this is an ideal that was only available to those upper and upper middle class women, because look at the lives of particularly, say, women in slavery during the Victorian era. Their children could be bought and sold out from under them, or they might have to take their children with them to the factory, or send their children to work in factories. So this was this ideal that somehow we use to define the family and womanhood was not the reality for the vast majority of people during that Victorian era.
But it showed up a great deal in the entertainment and in the images,
literature.
The popular literature of the time.
The magazines, the news articles.
And this persisted. Your mother actually had received a proposal from
when she was in college.
When she was in college.
Yep, she was a physics student, and she'd gone on a date with this guy. And
wouldn't you rather be
The Victorian era ended technically with Queen Victoria's death in 1901. And then we have the 2 world wars. But after World War II, when all of these veterans were coming home from the war and needed to be integrated back into society and they needed jobs, there was a real kind of retrenchment, a real return to this Victorian ideal of separate spheres and the cult of domesticity.
Almost a nostalgia for this bygone era, which makes sense after, the horrific trauma of the Great War. They were looking for the stability, this comfort.
Absolutely. But
normalcy.
Normalcy.
Which wasn't really normal.
Right. It was kind of this aberrant blip in history. But that's where we get the idea of women were entering the workforce at this time, and then they're coming back home to the 50s. It was a real retrenchment into that cult of domesticity and that separate spheres of the Victorian era.
And that blip of the Victorian era has really skewed how modern women view what they're doing. It's split us into stay-at-home moms and working moms, when in the past, there wouldn't have been a distinction between us. It's all work. It's all what we need to do to survive. It's all of us taking care of our families, taking care of ourselves, and trying to build life. And also that blip has led to a lot of women feeling, I don't have, my mother stayed home, so I don't have a model for being in the workforce. We have literally millennia of women working to support their families, working to support themselves, working to improve their circumstances. We shouldn't let this Victorian blip that was really propaganda.
And was reemphasized in the 50s, which is within, the living memory of quite a few people.
Leave It to Beaver.
Right? Yeah. But Leave It to Beaver, again, it's not a documentary.
No. It was propaganda. It was entertainment, but it was really propaganda.
And you have a very personal experience with how wrong that propaganda is.
Well, yes, because my parents were divorced when I was 3. That'd be in 1953. As a result, my mother had to go back to work. Now, she worked as a model, and I'm sure she worked something else as well. My grandmother, her mother, also had to go back to work because my grandfather died at the age of 52 of a heart attack. And so she went to work as a secretary in the local school.
A lot of our view of the past and of women's contributions to society, to business, to the economy, to survival have been skewed by this kind of blip of propaganda from the Victorian era up through the 1950s and 60s. The last thing we want to cover as we're moving into the series is we want to discuss some of the different approaches to women's history. I mean, there are many views for how to discuss women's history, but there are two that kind of dominate, especially as we move into Women's History Month. One is the emphasis view. That says that women have not been represented in most histories. They've been overlooked because of who was writing the histories or because their contributions weren't valued because of the biases of the time. So we need to emphasize women's history as a separate area to compensate for their absence in the rest of history, in the rest of how history is taught.
And that's the same idea that leads to women's studies majors and degrees in college.
Yep, exactly. Is that we need to have a separate area to really emphasize their contributions because they aren't represented in our traditional historical narrative. The second approach is the integrative approach. And that's where people say women aren't represented in our traditional historical narrative, so we need to dig into that narrative and try to incorporate women into it. Find the areas where women have been overlooked, discuss how women may have contributed to these stories in more ways, look for examples of them in our historical narratives. So that's the difference. There's one that has this, let's make it separate, let's focus on it to compensate. Then there's another one that says, let's go in, let's uncover and integrate. And a lot of times these two systems are pitted against each other, that we're going to war with each other. It's one or the other. We shouldn't have Women's History Month. We should just have history
But they're not mutually exclusive.
That's the thing. They aren't.
It really takes, I think, both approaches to come up with a holistic understanding of what history is.
And so that's one of the things we're going to be doing as we continue the series on women in the workforce, women in history, women in business, is both emphasize the story of women throughout history, but also dig into those stories and uncover where women have always been in that history but have been overlooked or discounted.
And really what we're talking about is, what is the context of history? When things happened, why did it happen? And what are the consequences of it?
And how can we better overcome our biases that are stopping us from seeing that?
Yes.
If you liked this episode, consider leaving us a review on iTunes, Stitcher, or social media. You can find Snark, updates, and behind-the-scene peeks at production on Twitter. Our handle is @HiddenBiz. That's @HiddenBiz. You can also find us on Facebook as The Hidden History of Business. Music for this podcast is from the album Time Within Itself by Michael Waldrop and used with permission of the artist. You can find out more about it on iTunes and Amazon. If you'd like to access show notes and multimedia content and the periodic rant from your hosts, be sure to visit our website at www.hiddenhistoryofbusiness.com.